During this week, the octave of Easter, every day is as if it is Easter Day. We are celebrating the resurrection of our Lord. And of course, the readings have to do a lot with the resurrection of our Lord. And notice in today's gospel reading, it mentions that the chief priests had come up with this plan to give the impression that just the disciples came and stole the body of Jesus. And it's so obvious that this is not the case, even though the soldiers were paid a large sum of money. Being a soldier and being on duty to guard a tomb or to guard anything, and if you fell asleep, you would be severely punished. So no soldier would want to take the risk of that. The other thing is that recall that when our Lord is laid into the tomb, they rolled the rock in place to seal the tomb. And to remove that stone would be extremely difficult. It would require a lot of energy, a lot of work. So even if the soldiers did claim to be asleep, the amount of effort that would be required to move that stone, the noise and effort, the huffing and puffing, the soldiers would definitely wake up. So it's an unbelievable story. But they make up this story because they don't want the resurrection of Jesus to be true. And the reality is not just the chief priests or the leaders of the Jewish people. Satan doesn't want this to be true either. Because it's by means of the resurrection that Satan is totally conquered. And so Satan can't stand it. And so even today, Satan doesn't want people to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And if you recall yesterday, I had listed off a number of facts as to why the resurrection of Jesus is authentic and basically provable, including the Shroud of Turin. And so even though we have all this evidence, some people, it's not just that they don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. There are some people today who don't even believe that Jesus existed. Even though, as I mentioned at the Easter Vigil, that, we count the years based on our Lord's birth. It's 2025, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. It's just, everything is so obvious that Christ exists, the church that came into being, the many saints, and so on and so on. And yet people still don't believe. They're just so blinded. So we need to proclaim the message of salvation. We need to make people aware that all of this is true. Now, in today's first reading from the Acts of the Apostles, Peter, addresses the crowd, but I wanted to focus on something that St. Peter quotes from the Old Testament, and it actually occurs in two places in the Old Testament. So he's quoting the Old Testament, and he says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One experience corruption." Now, in some translations, it's, "You will not allow your Holy One to undergo corruption." And St. Peter is quoting this to refer to the resurrection of Christ, that his body will not corrupt, his body will not decay, because he has risen from the dead. And this verse, "I will not allow my Holy One to undergo corruption," it refers principally and primarily to Christ. So God preserved him, or Jesus, because he is God, he preserved himself and he resurrected himself. But secondarily, it could refer to a few other individuals. For example, the Blessed Virgin Mary. Her body also did not undergo corruption. The question is, did she die or did she not? There's some controversy regarding that. There's no official teaching on the church. In the Eastern Rite churches, or the Orthodox churches, they do believe in the death of Mary, the dormition of Mary. And the tradition is that the apostles, that Mary did die, the apostles came and placed her into a tomb. And then Thomas wasn't there once again. And when he comes, he wants to see her body when they unveil the tomb, or her body is not there. So they understand that she was assumed into heaven. And speculation is that also St. Joseph, that he did die, but there's no idea of where his tomb might be located. And so once again, the speculation with St. Joseph is that he was assumed into heaven at some point. Now, recall in the Old Testament, there's two Old Testament prophets, Enoch and Elijah. And Enoch and Elijah did not die, but were taken up not necessarily to heaven, but they were taken up body and soul. The gates of heaven had not yet been opened. They were taken up body and soul. And if you recall, the prophecies pertaining to the coming of Christ is that Elijah will return. And Christ said, well, Elijah has come in the person of John the Baptist. But you see, that prophecy also refers to the end times, so that Enoch and Elijah will be sent by God back to earth, and they will be very instrumental in bringing about the massive conversion of the Jewish people. Now, this will be in the very end times after the Antichrist comes. And it's interesting when we consider all these things, because Christ died. The main consensus is that Our Lady died and Saint Joseph died. Now, these are like the most holy individuals. And it seems like Enoch and Elijah, like, how come they don't die? Are they like more special than Our Lady, than Saint Joseph? Well, you see, part of the tradition is that when Enoch and Elijah return, they will battle the Antichrist, but the Antichrist will slay them. In other words, they will die. So in other words, every one of us will experience death eventually. Now, this passage about, I will not allow my Holy One to undergo corruption, we can also apply it to many of the saints whose bodies remain incorrupt. And as you know, in the Catholic tradition, we have hundreds of these saints. Many years ago, when I was still quite young, I remember seeing it was a documentary on these incorrupt saints, and it wasn't from a Catholic source. In other words, it was kind of a secular source investigating these claims of incorrupt saints. And they went around and they examined everybody scientifically. They did experiments. Was there some sort of preservative used to preserve their bodies and all these things? And so what they discovered is that for the overwhelming amount of these incorrupt saints all over the world, there was nothing used to preserve their bodies. Now, it is true their bodies, they don't look that pretty. Their skin is like very dry and darkened, so they don't look pretty, but they didn't rot. They didn't corrupt. They did find a few saints that there was preservatives used on them. There were individuals who were very holy and the people wanted to preserve their bodies, so they tried to do something to preserve it. But like 99.9% of all the cases, there's no chemical, there's nothing on their bodies to indicate that they were artificially preserved. It's miraculous. And all of these things point to the resurrection also. In other words, their bodies, why would God preserve their bodies unless he wanted to resurrect them? Now, he will resurrect all of our bodies from whatever remains. Maybe it might be just a little bit of bone or pieces of hair, but God will use that to resurrect our bodies. How about people who are cremated and they're totally consumed by fire? God will recreate their bodies. So all of these things point to and affirm not just the resurrection of Christ, but our own eventual resurrection at the end of time. And when this passage, I will not allow my Holy One to undergo corruption, we should also apply it not just to bodies or thinking about the bodies of the saints or the holy ones, but when we are holy, when we are close to God, God will help us to prevent our souls from being corrupted by sin and error, false beliefs, especially near the end times, because the pressure will be to deny your faith. And remember, we have so much evidence, not just in support of the resurrection of our Lord, including the Shroud of Turin, but we have so much evidence for the existence of God, for the afterlife. So let us be bold in professing our faith, professing the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Just a reminder, as I mentioned at the beginning, just in case some of you came late, or if you haven't heard, Pope Francis has passed away. So please pray for the repose of his soul. Also pray for the election of the new Pope and that he will be a good leader for the Church.